Welcome to this conversation with an industry expert. In this session, I will be talking to Scott Watkins, who's got a very accomplished career as a scientist, but also the chair of the global board of directors at the Pollinate group, which is an amazing social innovation organization that works in India and Nepal. So you'll hear about that. And he's also clarifying in this conversation the need to think about how we can develop some of those skills that we associate with social innovation and change making, and how this is really essential for new graduates. So please join me in this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. The reason I've reached out, and I think you're a great person to talk to, is that you've blending this hard science background, which is your work, but with a passion for social innovation, change making, and innovative thinking. And I want to kind of focus today, I think, on the skill sets and the attitudes and attributes that you think are required for people to be able to juggle those two things, the hard science, whether it's engineering or chemistry, and then being an innovative and an innovator and change maker and positively contribute to our world, which is the reason why we at CQU is trying to embed social innovation is that it doesn't matter what you're studying, you should be able to have those skills, and you should have the capabilities to influence and take part in change making activities. So it's great to hear from someone from you who's accomplished in these fields, what you have to say about that. But maybe you can clarify and maybe explain a bit more about your current role and what it is that you're juggling.
Yeah, well, and maybe even I just step back a little bit and just sort of establish, what my experience was. So yeah, I, as you said, I studied chemistry, did a PhD, then went to the UK, did a postdoc, worked for some startup companies, and then spent 10 years with CSIRO back here. So from a sort of academic point of view, look, I co-authored probably 100-odd papers. I've given talks all around the world. I've visited and worked in universities. So I've done, all the sort of typical things that academics and researchers do. Lots of, big grants, both from government and also industry collaboration. And look, I really enjoyed every part of all of them. I enjoyed doing research. I really had a very positive experience in the UK and Oxford and Cambridge, and then back here in Australia with CSIRO. But my decision to leave that was really prompted by my exposure to what Pollinate Group is doing and to social innovation. So my first sort of entry into that was doing one of the programs that Pollinate runs, and this is where people from around the world can volunteer and go and work on a project for a couple of weeks to help grow the business. And the particular thing that we did on the first program I did was a impact assessment. So we were going into these slum communities in India that Pollinate works in. And at that stage, it was mainly just the solar powered lights that replaced the kerosene lamps. And we were asking people, what difference does it make to their lives? What has it enabled? And what other products were they looking for? And Pollinate has continued to do those impact assessments to measure the impact that we're doing and also inform the future of what we do as an organization, both in terms of area and types of products and the way that we target them. And so that really exposed me to this idea of a social enterprise as opposed to a charity model where charity raises money and makes something and gives it away. But a social enterprise is more about creating a financially sustainable business that's got 4 good aims. So the lights that Pollinate sell and cook stoves and the other things now, we sell them to the people in these communities, and they don't have a lot of money, but by giving them the light up front and then taking the payment over, say, 4-6 weeks, they immediately stop paying for kerosene, and so they can buy the light. And there's many things about that.
I was just going to ask, it's still predominantly women who are selling?
Doing the selling, yeah. So that actually wasn't the way we started. It was, we were just anybody we can get, and that ended up being mainly men. And up until a couple of years ago, we didn't have a lot of women selling things. But what prompted that sort of pivot was we actually identified another company then called Empower Generation, and they were operating mainly in Nepal. But their model was solely women entrepreneurs, all women selling. And we recognized that we had similar functions, similar aims, and in terms of, buying the products and distributing them and stuff, there was a lot of synergy. So we actually merged with them. And it's something relatively rare in the for good space. There was a lot of people that told us, like, charity, for good, not-for-profit mergers don't work. You get caught up in, arguments about mission. But the two CEOs who drove it, so Anya from Empower and Alexi, who was the CEO of Pollinate, they were just incredible at the way they were able to sort of, set aside egos and really focus on the problem. And so we brought the two organizations together. And at that point, we realized that there was a lot of systems and process stuff that Pollinate had that could greatly enhance what Empower Generation were doing in Nepal. But what Empower had learned about focusing on women gave us that realization that if we made that the focus of our sellers, we could greatly expand our impact. And so the people who buy the lights, it changes their life. Absolutely. Women can, read at night, children can study, families can interact with other families in their communities after the sun goes down. So huge impact. But by focusing on women who, as the sellers, we were giving them a job, we were giving them a source of income and a source of independence. And so the impact on the people selling was just as meaningful as the people buying. Yeah. So that's enabled us now to go from a situation where a couple of years ago we probably had a dozen women selling products to now probably 400, across India and Nepal. And each of those women is learning those skills. And I think, that again really emphasizes the benefits of this social enterprise model, where we absolutely do fundraising, but the fundraising powers our growth. And what the products that we sell, the model is that the aim is to sell enough such that we're financially self-sustainable, so that we can, reinvest all of the money back into the business there. And the other important thing about the social enterprise model is the value of the good, I think, is really emphasized to the people who receive it, because as opposed to them just being given something by some well-meaning foreigners, it's actually a business of local people who they interact with, and they purchase it. And they're buying it from someone who has empathy and understanding of their community. They know that if something goes wrong, they can come back to them, but it's a transaction. They've bought it. And so they really value that light.
I mean, it's a great example of, because I think some people always connect social enterprise with social innovation, and sometimes we have to, because I'm coming from a practice background as well, so that it's not always the same. But this example it's a great example of when it is a social innovation, because it's got so much more than, it's not just the business that is good. It changes, it changes the social relationships. It's changing how people are collaborating and working with other people. I mean, there's so much to it that fits in with that as a social innovation.
We're having impact at multiple in multiple different parts of the community, and it's maybe worth adding that I didn't start Pollinate. I came into it, as I said, a volunteer, but a group of young Australians started it originally, and they had a background, a mixture of engineers and economics graduates probably. But they really wanted to find a technical problem to solve at the start. They thought, we're smart people, we're engineers, we can find a technical problem. But it turned out that it wasn't the technical or the funding that was actually the issue. So that was the next area they turned to, for technical or funding. It was actually the distribution that was the problem, and what people refer to as that last mile distribution. So getting the products right into these communities of people who've moved from other parts of so taking India, they're typically economic migrants. They've moved to a big city for jobs. Their level of education is very low. They live in these very potentially temporary slums. So, you know, they live with the threat of being moved on every day. But some of our communities have been there for 20 years, living with the threat of being moved on every day. So that's, you know, that's a very different, very hard to understand lifestyle. But, you know, they're literally living in tents that are made from tarpaulins and, you know, bits of trees. But these people aspire to, as everyone does, to, you know, a better life. They aspire to their children getting an education, and the social innovation of providing a tool in terms of the light that enables their kids to have a better education, it just multiplies all the way up.
Yeah, and that's, I think, it's a great point, because it's that whole thing that if you're too technical focused on, we're going to come up with a technical innovation, it's not necessarily about that. It's about the unmet needs that the people in those communities have, which is, they can't study and they can't do those things, and they don't really care what light it is, maybe, so they use kerosene or whatever. But it's not about, it's more all those other things that will enable.
And that's what drew me to this initially. I mean, I was working on developing new types of solar panels, and we had this idea always that cheap, flexible solar could help poor people in developing countries, but that was coming from a very sort of Western-centric viewpoint, us, sitting in our labs here in Melbourne, thinking, these things are going to help the poor people. But going over to India and seeing, the actual communities, it quickly became apparent that, it would, but they don't need a flexible solar panel. I mean, and the ones that they use are just, existing conventional technology that are really cheap, that are, the offcuts of the cells that are on our roofs. But they do the job. And so at the moment, it was more about the distribution, getting them to the people that was the issue. And so it was my technical, I guess, focus and background and interest that drove me to be interested in this model. I went over there looking to see how they use solar panels, but I came back with an understanding of the social innovation challenge there, as opposed to the technical one.
And how was, come back to some of the other questions I had, but in terms of that experience of going over there, is that something you've done before in terms of working in that kind of environment, or was that a big transformational experience as well from a personal?
It was the first time I went was a huge experience. I was working at CSIRO, and I went, and and even amongst my colleagues, it was like this weird thing. Scott's going to spend 2 weeks in slum communities in Bangalore, and CSIRO were very supportive. I wrote these blogs while I was there, and everybody was fascinated in the idea. It was. Looking back, we were very naive about these things, and so it was, and it really opened my eyes to that side of things. And as I said at the introduction, I really had a positive experience as a research career, as an experimentalist, and in particular at CSIRO. But after that, it definitely seeded in my mind the idea that I could do something different with with the skills and the experience I had. That my career didn't just look like more papers, more conferences, more patents, more industry collaborations. I could sort of do something different. So I left CSIRO without a real plan, just an idea that I thought there were some other things that I could contribute to, and
that was all triggered from.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. I mean, the specific trigger actually was I was in a situation where we were having to make a whole lot of people redundant, and CSIRO was always looking for people to put their hand up, and so I did. So I essentially made myself redundant and said, that's one less person that we have to leave, and that that gave me a bit of flexibility to take some time to find something. But so I immediately, as soon as I left, I went back to India and helped facilitate one of the programs that Pollinate does. So So we had another group of people from around the world come over, and I was one of the leaders, the facilitators, because the program has a few aspects to it. One is the project that you're working on. I described the impact assessment, but other projects work on things like mapping the needs of communities or testing new products or, solving some sort of technical issues. But as well, we have an education, self-development part of the program. So in the 2 weeks, we'll get a few other people from social enterprises or full good organizations come in and give a talk. And we'll also sort of facilitate some professional development sessions where, we get people to reflect on what they're doing or how they approach things.
And that's people in the communities and...
Well, it's the people who've chosen to do the program.
Yeah.
So this is the international cohort that come in. So we'll typically have a group of maybe 10 to 15 people, and they'll have a small other project task that we work on, which might be, again, developing some, new information. We did some videos. Other groups have done things like, helping develop the training sort of education for the pollinators, the people who go into the communities. And so, you get this amazing chance to work with this group of people who've come together for these 2 weeks from all around the world and different backgrounds, and they're highly motivated, and you've got this real challenge to solve. And I think that was, again, another real difference for me from working in an organization like CSIRO, where we had a lot of training programs, and but they were fairly artificial. You're mainly with your colleagues or people from the organization. You go away for 2 or 3 days. You have some hypothetical challenge to solve, or and you have the whiteboard out or the butcher's paper, and the teamwork is a bit artificial. But going over to India and actually working on a real problem for 2 weeks with a much more diverse range of people, I think was a far more effective and valuable professional development experience for me. So doing it for myself and then facilitating one really got me hooked. And and then I just sort of continued volunteering with the organization. It was very young, and as we were expanding, I was able to help with a few different things. And joining the board and becoming chair was really not a grand plan. It was really functional at the start, just having another signatory on some papers. And but then as we evolved, we brought in people who had much more experience with corporate governance and sort of social enterprise development, and they've absolutely helped me enormously. So I've had this enormous education experience as a board member and board chair that has been gifted to me by the privilege of being in this position in the organization. And so that's, from a personal point of view, that's been amazing. And I think, going through the phases that we have done from this really small startup to now a pretty significant and sophisticated global organization, from a on the ground experience has been great, but the governance part has been, very, very complex and interesting too.
Yeah. I mean, I want to come back to your experience, but I will add a link to the organization, because if people would like to look into it or get involved, this is still things that you're running and you're...
For sure. I mean, I can't recommend the programs enough. And, and if anyone, I mean, there's plenty of information on the website. We've got a staff member in Australia who liaises with people. We work very closely with universities. We've got programs that run for like undergraduates and also for postgraduates or people who are more experienced, and a senior leaders one, executives one. But if people want to talk more there, I'm very happy for people to connect, personally. You can find me on LinkedIn or something, and I can give some perspective. But and there's many different ways that we interact. But I have a bias, obviously, but as a professional development course, as an experience, I can't recommend it enough.
That's awesome. I'll make sure the right contact details are included. I would like to just step back to kind of think about when you, from your personal experience, when you went to India the first time, and you went from working in a science kind of situation how did you feel like you were prepared for it in terms of the skill sets that you had, and what was the biggest challenges?
Look, I think the biggest sort of skill set area is around communication, and that where it's different, you know, from a traditional sort of research or academic sort of focus. I think, you know, we learn in a traditional academic pathway, we learn how to, you know, give lectures, we learn how to write papers and those sort of things. But in the, you know, in the social space where you're working with a much more diverse team of people, in terms of their cultural background, their degree of education, communication is a really big one. And I'll give a few specific examples. I mean, I think we're very well prepared in Australia by living in a very multicultural country. So we're used to dealing with people who English is not their first language. And I, you know, have learned over the years how valuable that is when I, you know, in India initially, but also later in my career, you know, we can touch on a little bit in Korea, just simple things like speaking more slowly and having very careful selection of your sentences to be very clear about what you're saying. And that's something that I think, you know, it's a really simple thing when we say it, but the impact of that on people can be enormous in terms of getting your message across. And then it's about also learning to listen. And I think, again, academia probably emphasizes the dissemination of information side of things. You know, people are very good at standing up and giving a lecture or pushing information out, arguing their point. But the ability to listen and take in information, we probably don't get as much practice at that. And that's really important. And just being able to stay silent sometimes and really take in what people are doing and then ask the questions to draw out a bit more. And I go back to that specific example I gave about the impact assessment, where we were, you know, we were going into these communities. I didn't speak the language, you know, we had a translator with me, but we were having to ask these people, you know, why did you buy a light? And, you know, that became an amusing question, because they were like, well, because I was living in the dark, you know, of course I want a light. But, you know, having to go a bit deeper than that and try and understand where they were coming from, what their needs really were, and really, you know, pull that out sometimes from people who weren't maybe used to anybody asking them what they needed or what they wanted. You know, these are people who were in situations where they had to fight for, you know, every advantage they had got. So yeah, speaking and listening and that broad area of communication, I think, is something that you know, spending time in a very different cultural and sort of language and you know, physical situation was probably the primary sort of soft skill development that I think is overlooked in a, you know, a traditional academic education.
It's a bit like what I usually refers to, you know, the participatory processes, where it is communication, but it's a bit like how you can engage with people in a way that you nearly collaborate to get to that point. Like you don't just ask them a question and then write it down and ask the next question. It's like you got to guide each other to get to a point where you both understand, you know, where the other one's coming from. Because I can imagine that would be, otherwise you end up with weird answers, like, because I need light. Whereas we're like, and then I guess it's also that to be able to see the bigger picture, which I'm sure could have been challenged as well. To, I mean, see the systems in those slum areas in order to understand that the distribution was actually the challenge.
Yeah, not just going there and looking at the technical details of the solar panels. You know, that was my safe area. That, you know, going and looking at voltage or current, or, you know, how much light was this cell getting, and, you know, is it pointing in the right direction and stuff like that. But as you say, looking at the bigger picture, what are the actual challenges here that are preventing that? And I think that, you know, like maybe to broaden it out even a little bit, I still do regularly have conversations with people more in the tech startup space and things. So different from academic research, but people who are, trying to make a new app or a new product or something like that. And those sort of questions they need to ask them too, like, what's the actual problem I'm trying to solve here? I might have had a really good idea for a widget or an app or something like that, but what is the problem that this is actually solving, so that it's not a sort of innovation push where you're just I've made this thing and I want to get it out there. It's actually more about working with the people that you're trying to assist to make sure that the thing you're doing actually solves their problem.
Did you feel like you got a lot of that? Have you, in terms of your learning experience, did you feel you had that from the beginning, or is that something you've also gone through in terms of developing how to do that with people in a place in order for you're obviously coaching others, but
yeah, I think I definitely had some opportunity to start developing that thinking at CSIRO, where we were really focusing on translation of products. So the research we were doing was quite directed towards actual real products. And so we started having conversations with companies about, okay, what does the solution look like? What does, a real product look like, as opposed to just the really fine science details of the solar cells, for example, or the light. And I think that's what sort of kept drawing me on. I thought, this is pretty interesting. This side of, the industrial collaborator sitting across the table. Because I think one of the things that I always comment about that journey was that we, when we were developing these printable solar panels, we, did a whole lot of research work and we scaled it up, and we thought, we've done this much work and there's only just this tiny little bit left to do before it all, hit the market. But the people from our industrial collaborators would come in and they would say, well, to us, it looks like you've done this, but there's still all this left to go. And so understanding that perspective, I got some opportunity to see that. And as I said, I think that's what drew me into wanting to continue down that line.
It's a bit like the fact that unless you understand that there's all these different disciplines that will look at the ask differently, you won't see that. You think that, we're pretty much done.
Yeah.
And someone with maybe the social researcher or whatever they are, or a human-centered designer comes along and go, no, we're going to actually go out and test it, and then and maybe make another iteration. And
the user experience and is obviously a huge part. But then there's also all of the the distribution angle, the manufacturing, the scale up. Whatever you're doing, whether it's a product or a solution, you have to work out how to grow it, how to get it out there, how to communicate it, all of those things.
It's a huge, and because I think that is kind of one of those, you've touched on so many things that I think is the reason behind from us that we would like to embed social innovation or change making skills. And I think the challenge for people can be, what does that mean? So when I work with academics across universities, it's focused on trying to unpack the skills and the attributes that are underpinning that to make someone able to engage in with different disciplines, with different people, different professions, different groups in society, and so forth. So in terms of your experience and what you're seeing now, do you think, what's your take on graduates, especially graduates who are coming from, or people who are focused on tech issues, whether they're engineer or other science kind of backgrounds, who are brilliant at their tech focus, but are there things that they are lacking? And do you think, and what do you say to them in terms of how they need to progress moving forward?
Yeah, there's definitely, it's a great question, and there's definitely a couple of things that I can offer immediately. So the first one is, particularly in your traditional research focused pathway, like going on doing a degree, doing a PhD, as I described, writing lots of papers. the person who's mentoring you, your supervisor there, the chances of you doing their job is so small. Like the proportion of PhD graduates that actually go on and become a professor in a research university is tiny. And so I think that people in academia have to realize that the vast majority of their students will not follow in their footsteps, and they're going to do a completely different job to what they're doing. So making someone a clone of yourself is a completely pointless outcome, really. You're better to focus on the 99.99% who will get industry jobs or research jobs that are much more applied than a traditional research career. So that's the first point. And then from the sort of student point of view, I think really recognizing that what the key thing that you take out of your degree is almost always not the technical learning that you're getting. So in my case, I learned an awful lot about organic electronics and really deep understanding of solar cells and the chemistry and physics behind it all. But that is actually not really that important in moving on to something else. What's actually important is that I learned how to take in information, analyze it, and then make a decision. And so that, I think, applies to so many areas of science and engineering, where we train people to be really, really good at analyzing data, situations, problem solving. But I think stepping back to a bigger picture and saying, that what your key skill is, that analyzing, decision-making, problem solving, then gives people the permission to apply their skill to a much broader range of areas. And so that's where, I see chemists and physicists going into things like, accountancy firms or management consultancy firms, or, various types of advisors in business that have nothing to do with, the background that they're doing, or becoming innovators themselves. So I think leaving aside the deep technical knowledge, because at the end of your, most of your degrees, if you've done some sort of research project, you're probably the world expert in that tiny little niche. And that's great, but it's not really that useful. But the skills that you developed to become that world expert, that's the value. And so I think even then, I said before, giving yourself permission to go outside, because there still is a stigma about, that person, they're leaving the lab, they're leaving becoming an engineer, or they're leaving becoming a scientist, but you're not. You're taking that with you. And I think those two areas, the supervisors and academics and mentors, recognizing that they need to educate their students to have a more diverse career trajectory, and the students recognizing that the skills that they learn is the most important thing, I think are the two biggest areas that I would give the advice to think about them.
And what's your view on, sometimes, because we obviously, all universities have some graduate attributes that tend to be the non-disciplinary attributes that we would like the graduates to have. And one of ours at the university is a social innovation mindset. So that's kind of what we're trying to unpack a little bit what that is. But in terms of, so part of the graduate attributes are stuff that you're talking about: communication, problem solving, critical thinking, which are essentials. But then I think the little bit unique thing is that we're putting in this social innovation mindset. And I think part of that, apart from the skills that I think you already mentioned in terms of working with other people effectively and collaborating and being open and able to understand some more systemic issues wherever you are. But some of the more lofty, in some ways, attributes usually gets mentioned when it comes to social innovations as, empathy is one that always is on every list. But when it comes to those kind of nearly I guess, even more difficult things to actually teach or get someone to develop. What's your take on that? Is that something that you think can be or should be explored earlier on, or can it only be experienced in the field, or how can we prepare someone for having that kind of attitude?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, but absolutely, it's a more challenging thing to teach. I don't think you can really learn empathy by watching a video or sitting in a lecture about that sort of thing. But I'll give one example that I often see in technical based sort of companies or organizations that they often struggle with, and that's part-time workers. So people who, the vast majority of people who work in science, they're all day, every day, they might work extra hours, they're passionate about what they do. And, the nature, particularly of experimental science, means that sometimes, you might start your machine running some experiment and, you need to stay late into the night to stop it doing that thing. But there are a significant number of people who, as in society as a whole, want to work part-time. And a lot of managers, in particular, science, engineering managers, struggle with someone who wants to work part-time. And they're like, how do I plan that person's, job or something like that? So learning, that you need to empathize with their situation and understand it, but then B, learning practical things that you can do to exhibit that empathy. So, thinking about when you schedule meetings, thinking about the way that you do internal communication so somebody doesn't get left out, being careful with your language. So saying that somebody works 3 days, not saying they only work 3 days, because, the use of the word only implies that it's somewhat less, but just being factual about that. So, those sort of things, I think, is one practical example of how, you need to think about the other person's situation and how you can get the best out of them, given the circumstances that you've got. So, to convert that into a practical sense, I guess the, project work while you're doing your degree, where people have different competing demands on their time, and not everyone can meet at the same time to work on the project or something like that. I mean, that may be a very simple early way of doing that sort of thing, but yeah, understanding other people's situation is a way of one way of developing some aspects of that empathetic mindset.
But that, I mean, in some ways that links, I think, to what you talked about earlier when you were in your younger days, when you rocked up to India and entering these areas, and you have a kind of a well-meaning but maybe slightly naive perspective on your role, and then you probably go through a process of realizing that, whoa, people are pretty capable maybe, and they actually just need these things, and it's kind of so if you prepare at that stage and think about your language when it comes to part-time worker, I mean, it can be translated to how you approach people in a different community as well.
Totally, and particularly with regards to educational background. I mean, just because somebody, maybe hasn't gone to university at all or something, doesn't mean they're not a problem solver or an innovative way. I mean, there's dozens of examples. I mean, I don't know, like, a random one. I mean, you look at India sometimes and you see people riding these tiny little motorbikes with an enormous number of things piled on the back of it, like, much higher than their body. And they're weaving in and out of traffic, but they've solved, packing issues, they've solved center of gravity issues, they've solved, the ability to, manage, their peripheral vision and, so not getting blocked and stuff like that. Nobody taught them that. They didn't sit down and, study, the physics of, how high can you stack things on the back of a motorbike. But they solved the problem and thinking, okay, wow, that person's an innovator. That they've got a different approach to thinking, but they had a problem and they solved it. So yeah, as you said, overcoming that naivety and overcoming that bias about you know, someone's only smart if they've been to university or something like that. That too is you have to open your mind to that in order to get the best out of the people you're working with.
Yeah. I mean, they've totally applied a iterative design approach through a practical trial and error methodology, I think.
Absolutely.
I'm conscious about time, so I don't want to hold you too long. I mean, you've got so much experience that we could probably just keep on talking, but I think, do you have any kind of advice and for both for teaching academics who are working with students, and especially in the science area, I guess, more when we are talking about embedding social innovation or into the curriculum, so preparing them to be able to do the things that you've done, and then you probably have a natural maybe ability to do it. But do you have any advice on what can they do to ensure that the students get some of those experiences? Because it's not always possible for students to go overseas, and which is great if they can, or to do a project in a community. So if they're not able to do that, do you think what's your advice on what they can do?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Maybe one area that I'll start with is communication. So I mentioned that at the start, and I think the more you practice giving talks, the better, and particularly to general public. So, you know, getting out there, and one of the best ways that I did was there's a federal government program called Scientists in Schools, and you get it matched up with like a school, and it's typically a primary school. If you can explain your science to primary school kids and keep their attention, then you're doing a pretty good job. So that's, you know, that's a really easy way of, because you get very visual feedback. If the kids are starting to run away, you've lost them. You know, you know that. So that's you know, I think one thing you can do. Also on that area of communication, a really distinctive skill that I've found recently is enormously beneficial is using, you know, apps or tools to make videos. It's a very powerful way of conveying information. You know, most of our social media content, we're drawn to videos, and from a, you know, even, you know, business sense, you know, with the company I work with in Korea, we're trying to do more video stuff to show people what our factories are, you know, show our attributes of the company. And so having the skills to use it, but tell it in a compelling way. So again, it's the technical thing. How do I use the video editor? How do I, you know, make sure I'm filming content that looks good and stuff and makes you think about it? But then also, how do I put it together in a way that, you know, it's not an hour-long video that's, you know, really boring, that's, you know, compelling and engaging. So I think, you know, that area of communication is one thing where there's some practical ideas that you can go outside of what you would typically do. From the sort of more innovation and interaction point of view, I know that within different startup communities around the world, these ideas of like hackathons are becoming, you know, much more popular, where, you know, an organization will get sometimes just a random group of people, maybe 4 people together. You're sort of locked in a room for a whole weekend, and you have to come up with something, you know, and it might be a new product or some, you know, an idea for a startup or something like that. But that's a way of doing something sort of for fun, and where you are practicing those teamwork skills, the ability to listen, to negotiate, to, you know, give and take, those sort of things that you can do. And, you know, if a really good idea comes out of it, maybe, you know, it goes on and becomes something. But, you know, really it's just about the practice of going through the process. And I guess just in between them, and again, it's sort of something I've seen with the startup community, is there are a lot of like meetup events in, you know, in most places now, where there might be an organization about startups or social innovation, and they regularly run sort of beer and pizza nights where someone will give a bit of a talk, and then it's just a networking session. And I've benefited enormously from going along to them. And I think when you do, you have to go along with a couple of things. It's, if you go along to a lecture in a university, it's, you know, like I said before, pretty much a one-way thing. you're just being given information. These meetups it's everyone's there to meet people, like it's in the name. So, you listen to the person talk or the panel or whatever, but then afterwards, it's just people, milling around and talking. And, the one piece of advice I give to people, it's not like a party where if you start talking to someone, you have to talk to them for the rest of the night, or you have to think, oh, how am I going to get myself away from this person if there's not any real, connection there? You can just introduce yourself to someone, and then you say, look, it's great to meet you. I'm going to go and introduce myself to some other people. And so it's very easy because everybody's there to meet people. So you're not offending anyone by sort of ending the conversation. And in another really practical thing in those situations is they'll typically give you a name tag to put on. Write what you are on the bottom of it. Scott, scientist, or, Tobias, engineer. It's just a little bit of an icebreaker to someone who walks up to you. You're giving them an entry. They walk, oh, you're a scientist, Scott. So something little like that can just ease in that conversation, make it easier to meet people. So I think, if you're a student, if you can do things like practicing public speaking, and there's organizations like Toastmasters or something, for example, that are just about public speaking. Great idea. Because I think communication and giving presentations is useful in writing papers, writing grants and stuff too. You have to convince people of your argument, and speaking it, as I said before, you get immediate feedback from the people because you can see, are you convincing them? Are they buying into the thing? So communication, maybe going to meetups, networking events, meeting people outside of your sphere, and then maybe going to sort of hackathons where you can work in a team to solve something. I think they're all things that are pretty easily accessible without having to sort of go to another country or go too much outside of your the constraints that you have as a student.
Yeah, I mean, and it's probably stuff that you could prepare people for there as well if they're not really ready for going out to a hackathon event. What you could think about what you need to do to prepare someone to do that if they really feel like it's a big leap for someone. So yeah, I mean, it's good.
The barrier to those is very low. I mean, if you're in a team, no one's there's no one's expecting you to like come up with the next Facebook or something in that thing. It's just about having fun.
Yeah, I mean, we're running some 3-day workshops at the university, which is getting people together and work on community challenges, and it's been very successful. So I think
it's great.
Challenge for universities to do it so everyone can join in, because it usually tends to be a smaller group. So but that's great. I'm conscious about the time.
I mean, I've still got a little bit more if there's any burning questions.
Well, I think, I'm curious, and I think maybe it'd be interesting to hear something about the innovation work, in the sense of, I don't know if you see yourself as an innovator at the moment, or if you're more of a coaching other people who are exploring ideas, but as an innovator, as someone who is thinking about different things, which I think you've done through your career and been interested in different solutions. In terms of doing that, I think it's easy maybe in a confined setting when you're doing it in a lab and you're technical. But what's been your learning process in terms of the actual innovation kind of process, together with other people who may not be part of your immediate team, or who may look at it a little bit differently?
I think most of my personal innovation experience actually came in the phase of working in research. I would say that post that research phase, most of my career has been more in that sort of coaching, enabling, mentoring sort of phase. But one thing that I think prepared me for that innovation mindset while I was in that research stage of my career was I was always really curious about learning about new techniques. So I would really push myself to try and learn a bit about something. And one way that I described it was that I learned enough about a technique or a thing to know what it is that I don't know, so that I could, you know, ask questions about it with some sort of, you know, sense of understanding or some, you know, authority, but that I knew enough to ask the question, but that I still had many unanswered bits. And so, you know, at a really practical level, you know, when I was doing experimental science, doing chemistry in the lab, you know, synthetic chemistry, making new things and stuff like that, I probably, as compared with most of my colleagues, did a lot more different techniques or different types of chemistry because I was drawn to, you know, learning something new. And then particularly when I went over to the UK and we were looking at these new types of displays and lighting, most of the chemists, you know, they would just make their molecule and, you know, have a little vial of the powder, and then they would hand it off to the person who was the engineer, who would then make it into a light and did testing. But I wanted to see the whole thing. You know, I wanted to go and, you know, do the whole process and take that thing. And so I did, and I learned how to do all the actual, you know, fabrication part of the things. And so I think, you know, then coming back to Australia, I was then in this position where I knew all the pieces of the jigsaw, and I'd done a little bit of all of them, a lot of these ones and a little bit of these ones. And then we were able to bring in other people who were real experts in these fabrication areas, but they felt that I was able to talk with them. They trusted me because I had some understanding of the thing that they do. Now you have to be, you know, self-aware enough to know where those limits are, because no person can cover everything. And then as a manager, you also have to avoid the temptation that just because you know a little bit about this, you're going to micromanage that. You know, so I would try and say, okay, I know about this, but I'm going to employ someone who's better than me. That was often our selection criteria when we were growing the team. We were like, we need someone who's better at, you know, making solar cells than Scott. And that wasn't often a very high barrier to meet. But then when they came, I really had to push myself to say, I'm going to step back. You know, I can talk with them. I can, you know, listen to their problems and ideas. But yeah, absolutely trust them. You know, I mean, one good example of management is, you know, employ good people and then get out of their way. You know, and you know, learning how to do that. And you know, is an important part. So, you know, to come back, I guess putting myself in a position to innovate, a key way of doing that, I think, was exposing myself to as many different types of parts of the process or the techniques or areas of the field as possible.
I mean, and that is a lot of similarities, even if you're thinking when you go into place like India or somewhere else where you may be thrown out of your comfort zone, that it's not about your expertise is in solar panels, etc., but suddenly you then have to go outside and work on a social problem, because you realize that, and unless you have a bit of that kind of, you know, self-confidence and self-awareness to realize that, oh, I need to step away from my solar panel focus and actually talk to this person about their social situation or whatever it is, I'm sure would help as well.
Definitely. And there's maybe one other thing that I can add too, about you have to think very broadly about innovation, and where you can help. You know, innovation is about doing something different or solving a problem. But in moving from, say, an organization like CSIRO that's, you know, big bureaucracy, it's got a lot of processes and systems in place to support what it does. So, you know, things like, you know, the way that you buy things, the way that you employ people, you know, there's tools and online things that you have to comply with, policies and processes and all that. In startups like Pollinate and you know, more recently with Parkrun, very tiny organizations, they didn't have anything like that. You know, like, all they started out with, you know, one co-founder taking money out of an ATM. You know, like it's not, there was no credit card policy with either of them. There was no, you know, HR policy. There was no system. And so one thing that I have taken from my science career and contributed to these social enterprises has been an awareness of processes, and that's like recruitment. So how do you design a job ad, a position description? How do you sort of set up a team? Then the mechanics, how do you advertise the job? How do you conduct interviews? How do you assess candidates and stuff like that? And then policies, like I mentioned, credit cards, leave, bullying and harassment, fraud, all these things that as an organization grows, you've got to consider those things. You've got to think, well, how can we as an organization deal with them, in our way? Because it's not like that there's one approach to those things that fits every company or every organization. So it's some of those things, those processes and like policies, I used to hate them in my time at CSIRO, and it sort of makes me laugh that they've actually become some of the most useful transferable skills in terms of assisting social enterprises with their growth. And
do you agree? Because I think in our conversations, and I know as well with social enterprise, a lot of them can be like, that's what they're lacking. They have the great idea, they take out some money and they do it, but then where it can fall to pieces is if they got none of those kind of systems in place.
Totally. I mean, they're always boring to the vast majority of people, and they're always frustrating, and they get in the way of you doing what you do. But they're absolutely essential. I mean, once you get beyond a very, very small team, you need policies and processes. But the challenge is finding the one that fits your organization and that can grow with it.
Yeah, no, it's good. Good points and good advice, I think, as well. Finally, like I mentioned, I'm going to provide a link if people are interested in the Pollinate group, because I think it's some amazing work, because it now goes beyond solar panels as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're doing things like sanitary products for women, as you mentioned, stoves before. We've got some fans. We've done some radios. Anything that can help the people, basically live a better life. We're open to doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example of that, where you need someone with technical skills and expertise, but then you need a social kind of awareness and understanding about needs in a community and so forth. It blends those very lovely together. I'll do that. Maybe a final question, like what's your, I mentioned a few times around our approach to embedding social innovation, but when you hear that, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but when you hear that this is one of our aims or goals at the university to do this, what's your top of your head? What do you think about it?
Look, I think it's fantastic. I think, I've worked with a few people, and this is not just, buttering you up or something. I genuinely believe it's important. I've worked with a few people who've, got roles like this, whether it's formal like yours, or sometimes someone's, given it as a sort of add-on to their more traditional role. And sometimes they struggle. Sometimes, academics are like, why are my students wasting their time doing this? They should be in the lab doing their experiments. I'm particularly at that research phase, they're like, I'm paying this student, I need them to get another paper out because otherwise I'm not going to get that grant at the end of the year. And I empathize with that, I understand it, but I think if you're in education, you have to realize that the things that you're teaching, this social innovation, this broader understanding of potential job paths, potential ways to impact are really, really important. And a traditional education that I went through, had touched on these things, like virtually not at all. It was all about the technical, education, and not at all about the softer skills and the impact and the way that you can realize that impact through innovation. So yeah, I absolutely think it's really important. I understand some, academics feelings about, that it's not well directed, or I can do it. But I think diversity of opinions and diversity of information is really, really important. And so, my advice to those academics is trust that this is of use to your students, because as I said earlier, the vast majority of them are going to go into non-research roles, and particularly non-traditional academic roles. So anything that you can do for them to help equip them for that more diverse range of careers is really, really helping them.
Great, thank you. That was, I think that's a good good place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your insights. Amazing work, great advice, I think, and it encourages us, I think, to keep on doing what we're doing, and encourages us to be experimenting in how we can do it in the best possible way. So yeah, very
for sure. And look, if other things come up, I mean, if we do, just on the Pollinate program stuff, the other specific thing to mention, are you aware of the new Colombo plan that the government has? Yeah, so Pollinate does participate in that. So we've actually got agreements with a few universities whereby we're the program that the universities send their students on, so that essentially funds their involvement with our program, and that's that's, I think, a great outcome, because building a longer term connection with a group, we've got it with a few companies and a few different organizations where they'll send people on the program every year, and so within their institution or company, they develop their own sort of alumni of Pollinate programs, and can share that experience through, and I've seen that to become a really important thing for them, to build that continuity there. So absolutely, that's something we'd always be interested in talking with at a university level. And some universities that's really top down, some it's just one faculty or one school somewhere in the university that makes that connection. But people can absolutely do it on their own. But more broadly, if there's other things that that I personally could help with, or connections that can make, don't hesitate to reach out again. I genuinely think what you're doing is great. So yeah, I'm happy to encourage and assist it where I can.